So I've been thinking a lot about Erwin Rommel lately, specifically kind of about his the way people look at him kind of in the United States and in Britain, and why he's considered by many people, many laymen certainly, to be such a great general. Certainly he was a competent general in many respects, but I think there were other German generals that were better than he was. So why is it Rommel has captured the imagination in the United States and Britain in a way that some of these other generals haven't? I think there are several reasons for this. Before I get into those reasons, let me just kind of briefly go over his career. He had, of course, served in the First World War as a lieutenant. He'd served in the Italian front. He'd kind of made something of a name for himself there as kind of a bold, offensive general. He wrote his book based on his experiences in Italy, fighting in Italy during the war, infantry attacks. He probably, he was one of these guys that survives the kind of the purges of the army, the downsizing of the army, I guess is the better way to put it, the downsizing of the army under the Treaty of Versailles that made Germany have just a 100,000-man army. And he is, by 1933, when Hitler comes to power, even though Rommel never formally joins the Nazi Party, he certainly, like a lot of German officers, a lot of German military, welcomed a regime that they believed would kind of mitigate the worst effects of Versailles, if not throw out that treaty altogether, and allow Germany to expand its army and really restore a sense of national pride. So certainly Rommel appreciated that as well, even if he never actually joined the Nazi Party. He did have a number of kind of important jobs leading up to the war. Among them, he served as kind of the army liaison, the army point man with the Hitler Youth, and he developed something of a friendship with Joseph Goebbels that kind of helped him out politically. Certainly during his great triumphs in North Africa, Goebbels and his propaganda machine really put Rommel out there as a great general. Now, when World War II begins, he's given an important job, but it's not the combat role that he wanted. He is essentially in charge of providing protection for Hitler as Hitler inspects Poland, the conquests in Poland, right after the army moves in, which is, of course, as I say, a very important job and a kind of, seen as being an honorable job, but it's not what he wanted. He's, so as I say, somewhat politically connected, but he certainly has connections within the army as well, and he is able to eventually command the 7th Division, the German 7th Division, which was a tank division for the invasion of the West, the Low Countries, and into France. And during that invasion, he distinguishes himself, certainly proves himself as a very competent general when it came to armor tactics and the use of armor in the war. He supposedly, his division could appear out of nowhere. It could move so quickly that that his division earned the nickname the Ghost Division because of this. So certainly Rommel was a very competent general, and he was a very good general. Now, a lot of times when you ask people in the United States and Britain who the greatest German general of the war was, they will say it was Erwin Rommel. If you're asking laymen, of course. If you're asking laymen, Rommel may very well be the only German general that they can name. Now, as I understand it, most Germans view Rommel as certainly a competent general in the war, but he's not kind of put on that pedestal that I think a lot of us in Britain and the United States often put him onto. And then a lot of this adoration for Rommel stems from, of course, his exploits in North Africa. That's really where he earns his name. And I think, too, this is really where we start to see the beginning of the Rommel myth really in earnest take shape. As I say, I think there's roughly 3 or 4 reasons why Rommel gets this reputation as this absolutely brilliant general, if not the greatest general of the war, which I do not believe he was. First of all, Winston Churchill builds up Rommel. He builds up Rommel. For instance, in 1941, when Rommel starts pushing into Egypt, I want to say it was about the time, I can't remember the exact period, I think it was about the time that he is laying siege to Tobruk for the first time. Churchill actually says in Parliament, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and, may I say, across the havoc of war, a great general." Says this in 1941. So already he's kind of building up Rommel here. The next year after the fall of Tobruk, during the second siege after the fall of Tobruk, Churchill famously gives that line, "Rommel, Rommel, what else matters but beating him?" Now, this is huge, and this is a big part of the Rommel myth and why Rommel is built up so much. Churchill is building up Rommel. Certainly the situation was dire. There was fear that Rommel would be triumphant, could take Alexandria and Cairo, and cut off the Suez Canal and cut the British off from their empire. That was a real danger. But also, too, the British initially weren't doing that well. They were a little overconfident. They'd been fighting the Italian army, which they had had successes against. And then Rommel comes out of nowhere, and he's kind of making a lot of advances. So perhaps Churchill, in saying these things, and this is not an entirely original idea, I've read this elsewhere, but perhaps Churchill, in saying these things, is kind of covering for certain deficiencies of the British at this time, which they will soon correct. But those initial setbacks of the British, certainly you can make an excuse if the opponent they're facing is some kind of a Superman, right? And I think perhaps that is probably what Churchill is doing here, is building up Rommel to kind of help explain why the British were not quite as prepared as they should have been. Now, the British, as I say, do substantially get better. As we know, by the fall in November, Montgomery has perhaps his greatest moment of the war. He beats Rommel at El Alamein in, as I say, in November of 1942. And that is a huge turning point in the war. In fact, Churchill later calls that battle like the hinge of fate. And he really builds that up. And part of that, too, is Rommel, and this is kind of maybe the second reason why the Rommel myth exists, and that is because with El Alamein being created by Churchill as, you know, one of the absolute great battles alongside Agincourt and Waterloo, Churchill is kind of giving to the British people not just an actual military victory, but kind of a propaganda moment that they can build on, that they can then say, look, we've beat their general, we beat this general, and now it's just going to be a continuous series of victories. In fact, of course, later Churchill will come up with a line, or I believe it was Churchill that came up with the line, prior to El Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat. Now, key to this, too, is building up of Montgomery. Now, I think Montgomery was a good general, and I think sometimes he's poo-pooed a little too much in the West, that is to say in the United States, because he is, we kind of see him in that contest with Patton, and we all kind of like Patton, he's our guy, and so we kind of necessarily disparage Montgomery. Montgomery certainly had his moments where he screwed up, as did Patton, but Montgomery, this was the chance for Britain to have a hero. And Churchill, like Stalin and the Soviet Union, understood the necessity of heroes. The difference is, of course, Stalin wanted to be always, first and foremost, the hero. But Churchill saw in building up Montgomery, you know, you could make him into kind of a new Wellington. And certainly there was a lot of people that disputed whether or not that was the case. Alan Brooke was certainly one of Montgomery's partisans. But many of the British military leaders, they weren't too keen on Montgomery. They did have issues with Montgomery. But Churchill, in trying to build up Montgomery, then has to double down on Rommel. He has to say, yes, Rommel was this great general. He was a brilliant general. Because if our great general can beat their great general, or their greatest general, then our general must be that much better. Our general must be an absolute military genius to beat this great German general. And of course, as we know, there were a lot of other factors in play. Because Rommel was so aggressive, he frequently overran his supply lines. I know Robert Citino, I think in his book Death of the Wehrmacht, kind of talks a little bit about this, about Rommel's kind of over-exuberance and wanting to overrun his supply lines. So that's a big part of it too. But again, this idea of building up Montgomery by building up Rommel, you know, that's, I think, another factor why Rommel is kind of cast forefront as this brilliant general in the minds of the British and the Americans. But there are other reasons why Rommel is why it's acceptable to say Rommel is a great general, if not the greatest general. Reasons that are really don't have a lot necessarily to do with his military prowess so much as his character. And what I mean by that is I really believe one of the reasons why Rommel is built up so much in the West is because Rommel, unlike, say, von Manstein, who was arguably the best general of the Germans had during the war, von Manstein, of course, made his reputation in Russia. Now, von Manstein, of course, had he designed Sicklecut, the invasion of France. He was a brilliant staff officer. But he had some rather brilliant successes in Russia, and certainly many of those too were inflated by later propaganda at the time and then subsequently. But nevertheless, you can't deny von Manstein was a great general. But the problem with von Manstein is, first of all, he was in Russia. We didn't have a lot of contact with him in the Anglo-American armies, and when the Americans joined the fight, Rommel was forefront in everybody's mind. Von Manstein is some guy fighting in Russia, which was considered a backwater of the fighting toward most of the rank and file British and American, certainly the British and American people. It was considered important, but I mean, it wasn't forefront in your mind like where your own guys are fighting. So Rommel fought the Western powers. He fought Britain. He fought the United States, at least somewhat there in North Africa, and then later in France and Italy briefly. Why that's important and why that goes to his character is because despite the persistent theories of the clean Wehrmacht, of the fact that though the SS committed atrocities in the Soviet Union, somehow the German army was clean. It never engaged in those sorts of reprehensible actions. Despite that theory, it simply wasn't the case. Thanks to some brilliant scholarship, we know that simply wasn't the case. The Wehrmacht was up to its eyeballs in blood. Certainly, Ron Smelser and Edward J. Davies in their book, The Myth of the Eastern Front, cover this quite well. Omar Bartov, Geoffrey P. Magargee, War of Annihilation. There's a lot of good books that kind of cover just how steeped in atrocities was the German army. There was no clean Wehrmacht. Maybe an issue I talk about later in another video. Rommel was not associated with that. Rommel was not covered in the odium of having served on the Eastern Front, where such atrocities could take place. Now, as I say, a lot of that is downplayed subsequently with the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, but in the years right after World War II, before that myth really solidifies, the idea Germans were Germans and they were behaving badly on the Eastern Front. Of course, the extent of those crimes are not known in the West for many years. But Rommel has nothing to do with it. He's not touched with it at all, according to the Rommel myth, according to the perpetuators of the Rommel myth, because, again, he wasn't there. You look at von Manstein, who I think really was a first-rate general. He was up to his eyeballs in blood. He was frequently, at his trial, he was making the case that he was arguing constantly with the SS over manpower and loaning manpower to the SS and back and forth. And the fact of the matter is, von Manstein was what he was arguing about was he'd loan men to the SS and then he'd want them back, so he could work with them. But there was no kind of moral objections between von Manstein and the SS for what they were doing, to civilians and what have you. So again, Rommel wasn't tainted with having served in the Eastern Front. And then, of course, I think the final reason why Rommel's myth persists is because of his supposed involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler. There is no hard evidence whatsoever that Erwin Rommel was an active conspirator in the fight against Hitler. At best, he probably was aware of the bomb plot and chose to just kind of not get involved. Again, that's best case scenario. It's entirely possible he really didn't have anything to do with it at all and wasn't even aware of it. But that seems kind of far-fetched when you consider that Hans Spadel, his chief of staff in France, was an active member of the conspiracy, and of course, because he was seen as being kind of anti-Hitler. He later is going to achieve high rank in NATO. But the fact of the matter was, there's no hard evidence that Rommel was part of the bomb plot. But yet, he is implicated in it subsequently, and he is kind of found judged to be guilty by the Fuhrer, and he is forced to commit suicide in October of 1944 by taking poison. And in that way, he would be given a hero's funeral, his family would be taken care of. So, kind of the idea of his association with the plotters, however real or imagined it was, that also perpetuates the Rommel myth, this idea that at his heart, maybe, he was an anti-Nazi. Now, certainly, he wasn't an anti-Nazi throughout his career. Even von Stauffenberg, the head of the July 20th plot, the author of the July 20th plot, even he was very pro-Nazi in the 1930s, for the same reasons I said that Rommel was. Von Stauffenberg very much liked the idea of a regime that was going to restore national pride and cast off the worst restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. But that idea that Rommel maybe had been a closet conspirator or it had something to do with it, that persists. Even despite the fact that his widow, Lucy Rommel, she even stated after the war that Rommel had nothing to do with it. Now, perhaps she didn't know if he had anything to do with it. Perhaps she was simply trying to maintain his honor by saying he was a loyal soldier at the end. Who knows? But certainly it wasn't necessarily politically expedient for her to make that comment, but she did. And she said, Rommel was not involved in the conspiracy. So that has to be considered here, too. So I think all of these factors, when you put them together, help to explain why Rommel captured the public imagination in a way that other German generals didn't. The public imagination in Britain and in the United States. Certainly, I think most Germans would say, as I say, Rommel was a good general, but they wouldn't necessarily place him above any others. He was just one of many generals. If there's any Germans watching this, feel free to comment. Let me know what your opinion is. But that is my understanding. I think Rommel was a good general. I think Rommel was a competent general, and I think he was able to achieve some really remarkable things. But I don't think he was a truly great general. I don't think he was a first-tier general because, as I say, he completely neglected one of the absolute most important rules of warfare in general and modern warfare, World War II warfare in particular, and that is your supply lines. When you're dealing with complex machinery like tanks, which have hundreds of parts, any one of them breaks down, the tank is useless. When you're looking at the needs of aircraft and supply fields and logistics, Rommel did not want to be terribly bothered with those things. And I think if you're a general who is not relying so much trying to cast off your ideas of logistics and just go whole hog forward in a modern warfare, you may be able to gain relatively spectacular short-term gains, but can you exploit them? Can you consolidate them? Can you really make operational and, more importantly, a strategic victory out of that? I think that's much more difficult, and that is why I would say Rommel. I would not put Rommel as a first-tier general. A good general, a competent general. I don't know that he was a truly great general in that sense. Anyway, those are just some of my thoughts about Erwin Rommel. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Please, if you disagree with me, that's great. I'd love to hear it. Please keep it civil. Also, too, if you are interested in gaming, wargaming, and board gaming, check out my other channel that is The Discriminating Gamer on YouTube. We have a lot of fun on that channel as well. Otherwise, please subscribe, and hopefully we'll bring out more content to you soon. Thanks a lot. Take it easy.